Eric Clapton was holding the guitar wrong. At least, that's what the sales clerk thought. 1963. A guitar shop in London. Clapton was 18 years old, scruffy, unknown outside of a few blues clubs. He picked up a Gibson, wrapped his thumb over the top of the neck. Unconventional grip, wrong by textbook standards. The clerk, maybe 22, 3 months into his first guitar shop job, saw an opportunity to demonstrate his expertise. He walked over. "Excuse me, but you're holding that incorrectly. Your thumb position will limit your playing. Let me show you the proper technique." Eric Clapton looked at him, didn't smile, didn't argue, didn't say, "I play at the Marquee Club," or "I'm about to join the Yardbirds," or "Every serious blues musician in London knows my name." He just said one word, "Wrong?" Then he started playing. What came out of that guitar in the next 30 seconds ended the clerk's career. The store went silent. The clerk's face drained of color. The manager came running, and Clapton, still holding the guitar wrong, kept playing. Because sometimes wrong is exactly right. And sometimes the person you're teaching is the one who should be teaching you. November 1963. A Saturday afternoon in London. The guitar shop was called Selmer's. Located on Charing Cross Road, it was one of the better-known music shops in London. Not the most prestigious, that would be the big department stores, but respected. Musicians went there, professionals browsed the inventory. The shop sold guitars, amplifiers, accessories, had a small repair section in the back, employed about 6 people, sales staff, repair technicians, a manager. One of the sales clerks was named David Marsh. He was 22 years old. He'd been working at Selmer's for 3 months. This was his first job in music retail. David had studied classical guitar for 6 years. He knew theory, he knew technique, he knew the proper way to hold a guitar, position fingers, execute scales. He'd been taught by a strict instructor who emphasized correctness over expression. David's instructor had been old school, a Spanish classical guitarist who'd studied in Barcelona in the 1930s. He taught guitar as if it were a discipline like ballet, rigid form, precise movements, absolute correctness. He'd told David repeatedly, sloppy technique leads to sloppy playing. If you cannot hold the guitar properly, you cannot play properly. David had internalized this. He believed it completely. Technique was foundation, correctness was everything, and the thumb always, always belonged behind the neck. Anything else was laziness or ignorance. This conviction made David a diligent student, but it also made him inflexible. He saw music in terms of right and wrong, not in terms of what worked and what didn't. And when he started working at Selmer's, this inflexibility became a problem. Because not every customer was a classical player. Many played rock, blues, jazz, styles that required different approaches. But David couldn't see that. To him, there was only one correct way. David was confident in his knowledge, maybe too confident. That Saturday afternoon, around 2 p.m., a teenager walked into the shop. Scruffy, working-class clothes, jeans, worn jacket, hair a bit too long, maybe 18 or 19 years old. The teenager walked slowly through the shop, looking at guitars hanging on the walls, not touching anything yet, just looking. David was at the counter, organizing some paperwork. He glanced at the teenager, decided he looked like a browser, not a buyer. Probably couldn't afford anything in the shop. The teenager was Clapton, but in November 1963, that name meant almost nothing outside a very small circle. Clapton had been playing guitar seriously for about 5 years. He'd been thrown out of art school earlier that year for focusing on guitar instead of his studies. Since then, he'd been playing in blues clubs, the Marquee, the Crawdaddy, small venues where serious blues fans gathered.
Clapton was building a reputation. The musicians knew him, the blues fanatics knew him, but the general public didn't. He wasn't on the radio, wasn't in magazines, wasn't making money. He was just another young blues player trying to make it in a city full of young blues players. He looked like what he was, a working-class kid who spent his money on guitar strings instead of decent clothes. He didn't dress to impress, didn't care about appearance, just cared about guitar. So when he walked into Selmer's that afternoon, nobody recognized him. To David Marsh and everyone else in the shop, he was just another teenager who probably couldn't afford anything but liked to look. But after a few minutes, the teenager stopped in front of a Gibson ES-335, a beautiful guitar, semi-hollow body, sunburst finish, expensive, more than most working people made in a month. The teenager reached up, took the Gibson off the wall, held it carefully, ran his fingers along the neck. David walked over. Part of his job was to monitor customers when they handled expensive instruments, make sure they were careful, make sure they knew what they were doing. "That's a lovely guitar," David said, using his friendly sales voice. "Are you familiar with semi-hollow body guitars?" The teenager nodded but didn't speak. David watched as the teenager adjusted his grip on the guitar, and that's when David noticed the thumb position was wrong.
The teenager, Eric Clapton, though David had no idea who he was, had wrapped his thumb over the top of the neck, over the fretboard. This was unconventional, non-classical, wrong according to David's training. In classical guitar technique, the thumb stays behind the neck, provides support, allows the fingers maximum reach and independence. Wrapping the thumb over the neck was considered limiting, improper, something beginners did before they learned better. David saw this as a teaching opportunity, a chance to help a young musician avoid bad habits. "Excuse me," David said, his voice taking on an instructional tone. "I notice you're holding the guitar with your thumb over the neck. That's actually incorrect technique. Your thumb should be behind the neck, like this." David demonstrated on an imaginary guitar. "That position gives you better reach and control. The way you're holding it will limit your playing, especially for faster runs and complex chord shapes." The teenager looked at David. His expression was neutral, not defensive, not grateful, just neutral. "Wrong?" the teenager said. One word, not a question exactly, more like he was testing the word, seeing how it felt. "Not wrong exactly," David backpedaled slightly, trying to sound encouraging rather than critical. "If you're serious about guitar, proper technique is important. I studied classical guitar for 6 years, and thumb position is foundational. Here, let me show you." "Wrong," the teenager repeated. This time it wasn't a question, it was a statement, like he was acknowledging what David had said and filing it away. Then, without another word, the teenager started playing. What happened in the next 30 seconds would be talked about in that guitar shop for years. Clapton started with a simple blues lick, nothing showy, just a classic B.B. King-style bend. But even that simple opening had a quality that stopped people cold. The note bent perfectly in pitch, sustained with vibrato that sounded vocal, human. Then he built from there. His fingers moved into a run, fast but not frantic, each note clear, distinct, singing. His wrong thumb muted the low E string, creating a percussive pulse underneath the melody, a technique impossible with the thumb behind the neck. He transitioned into a Robert Johnson-style turnaround, complex chord shapes that required the thumb to fret the low E string, literally playing bass notes with his thumb while his fingers handled the higher strings. Again, impossible with proper thumb position.
Then back to single-note runs, blues scales executed with phrasing that had emotional weight. These weren't just notes, they were statements. Grief, joy, longing, all compressed into 30 seconds of blues guitar. The wrong technique wasn't limiting him, it was the entire foundation of what he was doing. The thumb position David had criticized was enabling techniques that classical approach couldn't access. The sound that came from that Gibson, held with the wrong thumb position, was extraordinary. Blues, raw, emotional, technically brilliant blues. The teenager's fingers moved across the fretboard with a fluidity that seemed impossible. Bends that sang with perfect pitch, runs that flowed like water, phrasing that was emotionally devastating. And the thumb, the wrong thumb position David had just criticized, was integral to everything. The teenager used his thumb to mute strings, to create percussive effects, to execute bends that required leverage from the top of the neck. The wrong technique wasn't limiting him, it was enabling him. David stood frozen. His confident, instructional expression melted into confusion, then shock, then something like horror. The teenager played for about 30 seconds, then stopped, put the guitar back on the wall, looked at David. Didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The shop had gone completely silent. It was a Saturday afternoon, usually busy, usually noisy with multiple conversations and people trying guitars, but now, silence. One of the other customers, a man in his 30s who'd been looking at amplifiers, stood motionless. He'd stopped mid-reach when Clapton started playing, just stood there, hand extended toward an amp he'd forgotten about, listening. Another customer, a woman buying guitar strings for her son, had tears in her eyes. She didn't know why, she didn't play guitar, didn't know anything about technique, but what she'd just heard had moved her in a way she couldn't explain. The other sales clerk, a guy named Tommy who'd been working there for 2 years, looked at David with an expression of pure pity. Tommy knew exactly what had just happened, and he knew what was about to happen. The entire shop had gone silent. 3 other customers had stopped what they were doing to listen. The other sales clerk stood motionless, and from the back room, the shop manager, a man named Robert Collins, came rushing out.
Robert was in his 40s. He'd been working in music retail for 20 years. He knew guitars. More importantly, he knew guitarists. And he recognized the teenager immediately. "Eric," Robert said, his voice a mix of respect and apology. "I didn't know you were here. I'm sorry if—" He stopped, looked at David, looked back at the teenager, Eric Clapton. "Did something happen?" Robert asked carefully. David found his voice. I was showing him proper thumb position. He was holding the guitar incorrectly." Robert's expression changed. "You were teaching Eric Clapton how to hold a guitar? I didn't know who—" "Get away from him," Robert said sharply. Then to Clapton, "I apologize, Eric. Please, if there's anything you need." Clapton shook his head slightly. "It's fine." His voice was quiet, unassuming. He glanced at David. He was trying to help. But there was something in Clapton's tone, not anger, not even annoyance, just a matter-of-factness that made David feel smaller than any insult could have. Robert pulled David aside, spoke quietly but firmly. "Do you know who that is?" He said Eric, but Eric Clapton. He plays at the Marquee Club, the Crawdaddy Club. He's about to join the Yardbirds. They're going to be huge. Every serious blues guitarist in London knows his name. He's 18 years old, and he's already better than anyone I've ever heard." David felt his stomach drop. "I didn't know. That's the problem. You didn't know, but you assumed you knew better. You told Eric Clapton, that his technique is wrong. But the thumb position, his thumb position is perfect for what he does. It's different from classical technique, yes, but blues isn't classical, and he's not playing Mozart. He's playing music that requires that exact thumb position to execute properly. Blues bends, muting, percussive effects. If he held the guitar the proper way you were teaching him, he couldn't play the way he plays." David swallowed hard. "I was just trying to help."
"I know. But here's the lesson. There's a difference between knowing the rules and understanding music. You know the rules. You studied classical guitar. You learned proper technique, but you don't understand music. If you did, you would have listened to him play for 5 seconds and realized you were in the presence of someone extraordinary. Instead, you heard 30 seconds of blues that most professionals couldn't play on their best day, and you still think his thumb position is wrong." Robert took a breath. "You're fired, David. I need you to leave. Today. Now." David stared at him. "You're firing me because I tried to help a customer? I'm firing you because you demonstrated that you don't understand guitar well enough to sell guitars. If you can't recognize genius when it's playing right in front of you, you shouldn't be working here." David looked back at Eric Clapton. The teenager was examining another guitar now, seemingly unbothered by the entire interaction. "I'm sorry," David said quietly, to Robert, to Clapton, though Clapton didn't acknowledge it. David left, walked out of Selmer's for the last time. Eric Clapton stayed for another few minutes, tried 2 more guitars, didn't buy anything, then left as quietly as he'd arrived. Robert Collins stood at the counter, watching him go. One of the other customers, a regular, a session musician who'd been browsing when Clapton played, walked up to Robert. Was that really necessary? Firing the kid on the spot? Yes, because this isn't just about Eric Clapton. It's about understanding that in music there's no such thing as universally right or wrong. There's effective and ineffective. There's what works and what doesn't. David was taught classical technique, and he thinks that's the only right way. But Eric plays blues, and blues requires different technique. David couldn't see that. After hearing Eric play, really play, David still thought his thumb position was wrong. That level of rigidity doesn't belong in music. The session musician nodded slowly. "I guess, but the kid must be devastated." "Maybe, but sometimes you need to be devastated to learn. David's been here 3 months and he's been confidently correcting customers based on classical technique. Most of our customers don't know enough to argue, but sooner or later he would have done this to the wrong person, told someone their playing was wrong when it was just different. Better he learns now than after years of spreading bad advice." 4 years later, in 1967, graffiti appeared on a wall near Islington Tube Station. "Clapton is God."
By then, Clapton had been in the Yardbirds, left, formed Cream, become internationally famous. He was recognized as one of the greatest guitarists alive. David Marsh heard about the graffiti, saw pictures of it, and remembered the Saturday afternoon in 1963 when he'd told God his thumb position was wrong. David never worked in music retail again. He became an accountant. Steady work, no risk of telling legendary guitarists they're holding the guitar incorrectly. But sometimes, late at night, David would think about that afternoon, about the scruffy teenager who'd walked into Selmer's and picked up a Gibson, about the 30 seconds of playing that changed David's life. And he'd wonder, what if he'd just listened? What if instead of instructing, he'd asked, "How did you develop that technique?" Or "What style are you playing?" Or "Could you show me some of what you do?" What if he'd been humble enough to learn instead of confident enough to teach? But he hadn't. He'd seen wrong and assumed incompetence, made the mistake of thinking rules were more important than results. And Eric Clapton, holding the guitar wrong, had proven that sometimes the most extraordinary music comes from breaking every rule. Today, if you go to guitar schools, they teach various thumb positions. Classical position, thumb behind the neck. Blues position, thumb wrapped over. Rock position, various angles depending on the technique being used. Teachers tell students there's no one right way, there's the way that works for what you're trying to do. But in 1963, that understanding wasn't common. Technique was taught as right or wrong. Classical was correct, everything else was improper. Eric Clapton helped change that, not through advocacy or teaching, through playing. He held the guitar wrong and made it sound right. And in doing so, showed an entire generation of guitarists that rules are meant to be broken by people who know what they're doing. The guitar shop clerk learned that lesson too, just a bit too late, and at the cost of his job. Because when you tell Eric Clapton he's holding the guitar wrong, you're not just wrong about technique, you're wrong about everything.